This episode is sponsored by World of Warships, and we look at how Japanese carriers were so effective in the early days of World War II. For this we use some great in-game footage. For a free premium carrier and some in-game goodies, be sure to check out the link in the description. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy ran wild in the Pacific for around 6 months. In this period they attacked and conquered Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and parts of New Guinea. One key element in achieving this massive expansion was the Kido Butai, which literally translated means mobile force, yet strike force might be a better translation. It consists of up to 6 aircraft carriers, 2 fast battleships, various cruisers and destroyers as escorts. Yet the question is, how was the Kido Butai so effective? One key aspect in which the Imperial Japanese Navy was leading, and which is rarely discussed or mentioned, was the massing of carrier air power. So how did this look in practice or differ from other navies? The US Navy, for instance, at this time had a carrier in the center of a task force. As such, it could launch theoretically 90 aircraft, practically around 60. Yet the Japanese carriers worked together. As such, they could combine the aircraft of all their carriers. For instance, at Pearl Harbor they had launched 183 aircraft in the first and 171 in the second wave. In multi-division attacks, an entire carrier division of 2 carriers would contribute matched air groups to the overall effort, launching both of its dive bomber units, while a second division would launch its 2 carrier attack bomber units, consisting of torpedo bombers. These 4 squadrons, 70 or more combat aircraft, would be escorted by fighters contributed by all 4 carriers. In the follow-up strike, the division would swap out the air groups of bombers, thus sending a full and ready complement of dive and torpedo bombers again. Now this might not seem like a big deal for some of you, yet coordinating such a large amount of aircraft was not an easy feat. Especially considering that the Japanese had radios of limited quality in comparison to the US Navy. How advanced the Japanese practice was becomes apparent if we consider the following statement. In fact, Kido Butai was a truly revolutionary weapon system for its time because it embodied the conceptual leap from single carrier to coordinated multi-carrier operations. The US Navy would not acquire a similar sophistication until roughly late 1943, more than 2 years later. Yet we must also look at the technical side. At the outset of the war, the 3 Japanese carrier aircraft were the A6M2 Zero fighter, the B5N2 Kate torpedo and horizontal bomber, and the D3A1 Val dive bomber. And in late 1941 and early 1942, these aircraft were among the world's finest, and with important exceptions could generally fly faster and farther and could outperform their American counterparts. So let's take a closer look at them. The Zero is probably the most iconic Japanese aircraft of World War II. It was introduced in 1940 and such brand new. It had a very long range, good climb rate, and excellent maneuverability. In the hands of the well-trained and in many cases veteran Japanese pilots, it seemed unparalleled in the early months of the war. It was during these early months of the war that the myth of the near invincibility of the Zero was born in the minds of Allied pilots, trying vainly to match the Zero turn for turn, and finding themselves in the aerial environment where the A6M performed best: relatively low speed, low altitude dogfighting. They found themselves at the mercy of Japanese Navy pilots who chinked about the tropical skies, flaunting their acrobatic skills like rapiers. The Zero was a great carrier fighter, and of course it also had various weaknesses, but these were initially not known to the Allies. The Zero would not only defend the Japanese carriers, but also provide long-range fighter escorts for carrier-borne and even land-based bombers. So next, let's look at carrier-based bombers, namely the B5N2 Kate. The Kate was capable of torpedo and level bombing. In 1941 it was likely the best carrier-borne torpedo bomber in the world. It could be equipped with a torpedo which was almost 10 knots faster than the US equivalent. Additionally, it was more reliable, could be dropped at higher altitude and speed. Thus the Japanese torpedo planes had a significant advantage when it came to the weapon loadout. For level bombing attacks, the Kate was usually equipped with up to a 1 800 kg bomb, or various combinations of smaller weapons. Its main issue was its vulnerability to fire and weak defensive armament. The last of the three was the D3A1 Val dive bomber. It could be equipped with an up to 250 kg bomb in the center and two 60 kg bomb on the wings, although the 60 kg bombs were usually not part of a regular loadout. Similar to the German dive bomber the U-87 Stuka, the D3A1 only had a non-retractable landing gear. Yet the major drawback of the D3A1 against its US counterparts was the limited bomb load. Whereas the SBD Dauntless could easily carry a 454 kg bomb, the largest single bomb of the D3A was 250 kg. The main issues were the same as with the Kate. Although it was a fine plane in general, it clearly lagged behind the Kate and the Zero. Now since we're already at the technical side, let's take a short look at the Japanese carriers as well. Although the Japanese did not possess the first carrier in the world, they had the Hosho, the first aircraft carrier that was designed and commissioned as an aircraft carrier. By the time of World War II, it was of course completely outdated, but the Japanese drew many important lessons from it. These lessons led to the Shokaku class carriers, which were considered by some historians as the best of its time. In many ways, the Japanese were in the forefront of carrier design, and in 1941, two Shokakus, the culmination of pre-war Japanese carrier design, were superior to any carrier in the world then in commission. Each of them had a loadout of 18 fighters, 27 dive bombers, and 27 torpedo bombers. Additionally, another 12 reserve aircraft. They had a long range and a maximum speed of 34 knots. To put this in perspective, one of the fastest ship classes, the USS Fletcher class destroyers, reached 38 knots. This was achieved by their extremely powerful engines that provided even more horsepower than the super battleship Yamato. As you can see, even if one does not consider the Shokaku class carriers as the best of its time, they clearly were outstanding ships in many aspects. Another important aspect, of course, was that the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the numerical superiorities in carriers as well, with 9 regular and 1 light carrier at the beginning of the war in the Pacific, whereas the US Navy possessed 6 operational carriers at that time. Yet let's move away from the technical aspects and move to another one, namely training. The Japanese are well known for the rigorous trainings of crews, and in this case we will focus mostly on the air crews. A particular feature of advanced Japanese naval air training in the interwar period was a tactical training process called Zengi. Combat skills comes perhaps closest to an English translation of the word, and it referred to a series of tests undergone by individual air crews and judged by fellow flyers. This training was not limited on combat tactics, it included aspects like leadership, maintenance, communications, and others. This also meant that ground crews were included as well. It also included a lot of input from junior officers, although one major issue was that Zengi and other training practices over time became formalized and routinized, which decreased their impact. A key difference to the US Navy was that the Japanese had no concept of mass training of pilots. They focused on quality over quantity. The result was that pilots in early war were usually excellent, yet once attrition set in, the quality of pilots severely decreased. To give you a basic idea on the rigorous selection, the Japanese ace Saburo Sakai was one of 70 pilots out of a pool of 1,500 applicants in 1937. Yet this selection was done before the training started. The training itself included expulsion practices, which led to pilots being dropped for the slightest infractions. Hence about 25 graduated in 1937. Yet since some of the dropout criteria were not performance-based, some excellent pilots might have been lost along the way. Nevertheless, By 1941, in training and experience, the Navy's fighter pilots as a whole were among the best in the world, and its carrier pilots were probably the best among the world's 3 leading carrier forces. Of course, we should not forget that there's a clear difference between training and combat. Yet due to the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army also had plenty of combat experience. And some of the previously mentioned strengths of Japanese equipment and personnel were directly or indirectly influenced by the wartime experience. The Japanese air campaign against China strongly influenced the development of Japanese naval air power and Japanese naval thinking prior to the Pacific War. To begin with, despite the deeply rooted fixation of the Imperial Japanese Navy on warships as the decisive weapon of naval war, the Navy's air war in China brought home to nearly its entire leadership the tremendous potential of aerial weapons. Lessons from the war in China included many crucial aspects, for instance the requirement for a long-range fighter escort for bombers. This was the reason why the Zero possessed such a long range in comparison to other contemporary fighters. Additionally, Japanese pilots gained vital combat experience. Hence, many Japanese pilots were not only extensively trained but were combat veterans as well, when they went up against the US pilots. To summarize, when the Imperial Japanese Navy started the war against the United States by attacking Pearl Harbor, it possessed a very potent carrier force, which possessed many advantages on different levels. First, the Japanese had achieved a level of coordinating their carrier air groups to such a level that they could launch coordinated attacks of several hundred aircraft repeatedly. Second, the aircraft, although not without flaws, were in many cases outstanding in strike load, range, and maneuverability, which allowed them to deal devastating strikes. Third, the Japanese possessed more carriers than the US Navy. Additionally, some of these carriers were the 2 Shokaku-class carriers, which were among the best in the world. Fourth, rigorous training of pilots made them likely the best carrier pilots of the world at this time, which is also in combination with the final point, the previous combat experience from the war in China, which had an influence on many of the previously mentioned points as well. As such, when the Imperial Japanese Navy started the war, it had a clear edge against the US Navy on the tactical and operational side, yet many of these benefits would be detrimental in the long run. Furthermore, although the Imperial Japanese leadership was clearly aware of the potential of carrier forces, the First Air Fleet was still not regarded by the Japanese naval leadership as the main element of the combined fleet. According to the Japanese naval orthodoxy, that role was still reserved for big ships and big guns. And speaking of big ships and big guns, this brings us to the sponsor of this episode, the free-to-play game World of Warships. Recently, World of Warships revised the carrier gameplay, and to celebrate this, they provided a special code for new players that gives them immediate access to a US premium carrier, the USS Langley. Additionally, you will receive 1 million credits, 250 doubloons, 1 port slot, and 3 days of premium time. World of Warships features over 300 ships, including the Shokaku, the Yamato, USS Iowa, HMS Warspite, the Bismarck, the Graf Zeppelin, and many more. The game is a nice blend of action and outthinking your enemy in large naval battles. So if you want to dive bomb one of over 30 million players worldwide, head on in. Of course, you can also slug it out at long range, or deliver a spread of torpedoes up close and personal. Additionally, the game offers new missions and events each week. Big thank you here to World of Warships for sponsoring this episode. Be sure to check out the link in the description. Special thanks to Justin for helping me out with the script and sources. As always, sources are linked in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.